Thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to come and give this talk. It's such a pleasure being here. This is such a nice crowd online and here in the room. And I really enjoyed all the beautiful papers yesterday. It gave me lots of food for thought. Now, in this presentation, I would like to talk about typography from a semiotic perspective. That means that I'm interested in how typography creates meaning. And more specifically, I'd like to present and discuss a methodological framework for typographic analysis. My focus is on typography in the novel, but the framework can be employed for analysis of typography in other types of texts as well. The novel or different novels just happen to be the data material that I've started working on. Okay, so here is an outline of my presentation. I will start with a bit of background information to situate the work I'll be presenting today, explaining why I work with typography and why I approach typography the way I do. That will lead me to the basic research questions behind my work. And from there on, I will focus on the multimodal semiotic approach to typography that informs my work. And I will present a framework for analysis. Throughout, I will illustrate my points with examples from some of the novels I've been analyzing. And finally, I'll wrap up with a discussion and some concluding remarks. So let me start with some theoretical background by situating my work so that you know where I come from and why I do what I do. I started out as a stylistician doing stylistics. And in stylistics, well, stylistics is a field of research where we focus on how meaning is created through language, in literature, and in other types of text. It's an approach to literary analysis that is very systematic and detailed and often very grammatical in outlook. So what we do is we use linguistic concepts and methodologies for analysis, and we support our interpretation with linguistic evidence. So all that means that our analysis and interpretations will be solidly anchored in the actual text. Now, at some point, I came across a novel like Jonathan Safran Foer's novel, extremely loud and incredibly close. And you see a couple of pages from that novel here. That novel makes use of images, color, special layout, special typography for its meaning making. And I realized that as a stylistician, I didn't have any tools for handling the meanings that were created by those elements of Foer's narrative. Sorry, I just have to get rid of the image of myself here on my screen so that I can see my slides. Okay, so roughly at the same time, I came across the social semiotic approach to multimodality called multimodal semiotics. Some of the main proponents are Theo van Leeuwen and Gunther Kress, that you may know from their work reading images, for instance. And multimodal semiotics is an approach to communication that acknowledges all the semiotic modes that go into communication, all the semiotic resources, if you like. That is wording, typography, layout, color, images, but also stuff like sound and gesture and so on. And like stylistics, multimodal semiotics is an approach to communication that is very systematic and detailed, and I would say grammatical at heart. So the very basic idea behind my work was to combine the two approaches and develop a new stylistics framework for text analysis that, in addition to language, wording, could handle all the semiotic modes that we see in a novel like Foes. And that is what I have written about in my book that you see up here, Multimodal Stylistics of the Novel, and the approach is called Multimodal Stylistics. Okay. The object of analysis, or my object of analysis, is novels for adults. And more specifically, I approach the novel as a semiotic object consisting of wording, layout, typography, photographs, drawings, and other graphic elements, paper, binding, and book cover. So it's basically the idea that what I analyze is the novel that I pick up and read and try to find out how do we make sense of that as a semiotic object. So not just a verbal narrative. I structured my work around the different semiotic resources or modes. And one that I found particularly interesting is typography, and that is what I will be talking about today. Before I do so, I think I have to be honest. When I started my work, I didn't actually know very much about typography. And I'm still not the kind of expert who can look at just any typeface and say, oh, that's a Bergoni, or oh, that's a Rockwell. I'm not an expert on type history, and I'm pretty sure that I'm typographically ignorant in several other ways as well. But when I started looking at typographic meaning in the novel, I soon found out that what I needed to know something about was what meaning does typography create? How does that meaning come about? How is that meaning created? And how can we describe that and explain typographic meaning making in a systematic and consistent way? So my approach is semiotic. I'm interested in the what and the how of typography. That is, what does typography mean? How does it mean? And these are the very basic research questions that inform my work. Before I proceed, I think I have to say a few words about how I define typography as my object of analysis. In one sense, the concept of typography I'm using is a very broad one, in that it extends from handwriting to printed typography. And this is motivated by the belief that a number of common semiotic principles are at play when the visual side of language creates meaning. And it doesn't really matter whether the text is written by hand or calligraphed or printed. So if we take this double-page spread from Jonathan Safran Foer's novel as an example, we have printed type as well as handwriting. And the framework that I'll be presenting now can be used to describe the meaning-making potential of both. So it is a broad concept in one sense, but in another sense, it's actually narrow, because I distinguish between typography and layout as separate modes. And those modes are, of course, very closely integrated in the semiosis of a given text. So I distinguish between typography, on the one hand, as the graphic appearance of writing in terms of the shape, size, color, and so on of the letter forms. And then, on the other hand, a layout as the overall spatial page design of a given text, including margins and letter spacing and line spacing. This is controversial. I think I'd been here for an hour when I first arrived, and Janne started discussing that with me. So I think I have to explain a little more here, that I believe that all texts, all acts of communication are multimodal. So that is my object of analysis. My object of analysis is multimodal. But when I talk about individual modes. When I talk about layout, when I talk about typography, I think I do so because I see those concepts as necessary theoretical abstractions that will allow me to talk about multimodality. So I don't think modes exist on their own. Typography and layout cannot be separated, but for analytical purposes, it can make sense to do so, to talk about how they interact. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce the tools that I'm using for typographic analysis. The tools were originally developed by Theo van Leeuwen and first presented in the 3 texts that you see up here. In my own work, I'm very much inspired by Theo's work, but I have suggested adjustments and additions to the approach in the light of the data that I have been analyzing. In Van Leeuwen's work and in my own work, we both focus on distinctive features of typography and typographic semiotic principles, and that's what I'll be talking about now. Okay, the distinctive features approach to typography focuses on the features that set one typeface off from another. And what you see here, I hope you can see the list, yes. What you see here is Theo van Leeuwen's list of distinctive features. I'm using many of the same features as him, but I have made additions and adjustments, and I'm going to talk about my own list of typographic features that I find useful for analysis. So the idea is that a given typeface can be described in terms of its weight. It can be light, it can be bold, and of course somewhere in between. So these are not binary choices, but there are gradations between light and bold. It can be in terms of expansion, it can be wide or condensed. In terms of slope, it can be upright or sloping, and it can be sloping to different sides. In terms of curvature, it can be angular or rounded. In terms of connectivity, it can be connected or disconnected. It can be oriented horizontally or vertically. We can describe a typography in terms of its endings, in terms of its regularity. Is it regular? Is it irregular? And if irregular, is that irregularity regular or irregular? And I have also added color and size. Now, as you remember, Helen McGowan, she's over there. She actually talked about some of these features yesterday in her wonderful presentation about Japanese calligraphy. I think you talked about angularity and connectivity, and maybe a third one, I can't remember that. Yeah, maybe we can get back to that after my talk. Now, one of my points here is that we have these different features. We can use them to describe a given typography, but also that the different features result in different meaning. I'm interested in meaning primarily. One of the features I have added is color, and that is because several texts in my data used typefaces in different color. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. But now I'll just say that adding color made me realize that what I'm talking about, and also what Theo van Leeuwen is talking about in much of his work, is in fact typographic use rather than simply typography. Clearly, I mean, if we have Times New Roman in blue, that differs from Times New Roman in black, and I needed to be able to capture that in my work, but it's still Times New Roman, right? So I tend to focus on typographic use. Another thing I realized was that I needed to be able to talk about distinctive features at different levels of the text. I won't go into that now, but I'd just like to mention that much inspired by Hartmut Stöckel and my colleague back home, Christian Mosbæk Johannessen, I have introduced 4 levels at which these distinctive features may need to be considered. Sometimes we simply, in our analysis, need to specify whether the distinctive feature we're talking about is a feature of the stroke, a feature of the individual letter, a feature of the line or text block, or a feature of the page. Okay, so talking about typographic distinctive features is a way of describing what the different typefaces look like, that is, talking about their form. Van Leeuwen argues that these distinctive features have semiotic potential, that is, they can mean something. What you see here are some examples. He has a long list in an article that I turned into a list. I'm just adding some of them here. So these are some of his examples of the meaning potential of some of the distinctive features. In terms of curvature, for example, an angular typeface in Van Leeuwen's view may signify qualities such as masculine and technical, whereas roundness can signify, for example, organic or natural or feminine. Weight. In terms of weight, bold can signify something assertive and solid, whereas light typography can signify something more insubstantial or timid. In terms of slope, sloping is often used to signify handcrafted, organic, personal, informal, whereas upright typography or typefaces seem more mechanical, can communicate something about them being mass-produced, impersonal, and formal. So these are the potential meanings of the distinctive features. We see a somewhat stereotypical example of the meaning potential of distinctive features in this example from John Gray's, I suppose it's a kind of self-help book called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Women. No, Women Are From Venus, sorry. Where the typeface of the part that refers to men is angular, it's relatively bold, it's upright, and it is realized in a stereotypically male color. Whereas the part referring to women is more rounded, it is light, it is sloping, and it is realized in a stereotypically female color. So, sometimes it's good to illustrate something with stereotypical examples, and this is definitely one of them. It's really important for me to emphasize that typographic meaning often depends on context. So there's no one-to-one relationship between typographic form and meaning. What we're talking about here is the fact that different distinctive features have meaning potential, the potential to express certain meanings. I think we have to be very careful not to take a list like this and say, oh, here's a typeface that is rounded, that means X, right? So we have to consider that meaning in context. Okay, let me just see how I'm doing for time, that's fine. I'd like to move on and talk about typographic semiotic principles, because now Van Leeuwen claims that these distinctive features of a typeface can have semiotic potential. In addition to that, I agree with him when he says that there are often some more general semiotic principles at play when typography creates meaning. Van van Leeuwen has introduced two such typographic semiotic principles, metaphor and connotation. I was not awfully happy with those categories when working on my data. I'm very inspired by the approach, but for various reasons, I chose to work with slightly different categories, and four of them. And as you can see, three of them are some that I have borrowed from Peirce. I have to say that I'm not a Persian semiotician, but I found these concepts really useful in this context. So in my view, much typographic meaning can be described as either indexical, iconic, symbolic, or as discursive import. And in my next slides, I'd like to explain the four semiotic principles and show you examples from my literary data. So, what you see here is what the typography looks like in most novels for adults. It's plain black typography. Here, the relation between the typographic signifier, that is the look of the typography, and that which is signified can be said to be arbitrary and therefore symbolic in Peirce's sense of the word. I'm sure that experts on typography will be able to say all kinds of things about the specific kind of typeface, its place in history, its readability, and so on. But I think that for most readers of a given novel, well, they're likely not to notice the typeface at all. They just read for the narrative in an example like this. And I think that they may only register it as typographically conventional, and that's probably the meaning, the typographic meaning that is created here when seen from a semiotic perspective. Indexical typographic meaning is seen when a typographic signifier shows traces of its own coming into being. So it can be seen as a marker of the person or the tool that produced the text. I think that is probably also what Helen talked about yesterday, maybe not in these terms, but it's sort of the same thing. So I think there's quite a nice connection between our two talks. Now, in the first example here from J.J. Abrams and Doc Durst's novel S, we see examples of indexical meaning. This is a novel that has been designed very deliberately and very carefully. It's a novel from 2013, but it has been created to look like an old library book. It's got what seems and feels like a cloth binding. It's got library stamps at the back. It's printed on yellowed stained paper, as you can see here, which makes the book look old. But I think the most striking feature of the novel is the occurrence of handwritten notes in the margins throughout the book, what you can see here. And I have to say, these are not my notes. These notes are part of the novel and the meaning that the novel creates. The notes are comments that are exchanged by two students, Jen and Eric. Thing is, they read the book in the library, or maybe they take it out of the library, I can't remember, and they write notes in it, and they comment on each other's notes and start sort of exchanging ideas through those notes that we see in the margins. So the notes are about the narrative they read. They're quite fascinated by the book they're reading. It's about its enigmatic author. And it also develops into a kind of relationship so that those notes end up also being about themselves and their own lives. So these notes in the margins actually develop into a narrative that turns out to be just as important as the printed story of the book. It makes the book really difficult to read because you have to decide, do I read the printed text, do I read the notes, and in which order? But it's also quite fascinating. Now, what I wanted to use this example for was to talk about the handwriting, because that can, of course, be seen as material traces of the people who wrote the notes, authenticating Jen and Eric to the readers. And therefore, of course, it's a good example of indexical typographic meaning. But the thing is, Jen and Eric never existed. So these are, of course, fictional indexes created by the designers of the book as a means of manipulating readers into suspending our disbelief in this respect, to make us forget for a while that Jen and Eric don't exist. Or maybe to make us think about the fact that they don't exist. I don't know. But if we describe the handwritten notes here in terms of their distinctive features, we see that Jen's notes are characterized by being irregular, rounded, sloping, and connected, whereas Eric's notes in block capitals is more regular, but of course not as regular as printed type. It's more angular, and it's disconnected. So, of course, it was important for the designers of the book to choose different styles for the two characters so that we can distinguish between them, know who is writing what. But at the same time, I think it's interesting to note that the features of Jen's handwriting are actually those often associated with female contexts, while the style of Eric's writing may be seen to construct the meaning of male, typographically speaking. It might have been exactly those culturally founded typographic meanings that motivated the designers of the book to choose these specific styles for the two characters, whether consciously or not. But I think it's quite an interesting example also in dialogue with Helen's presentation yesterday. Okay, so here we saw indexical meaning as with the typography being a marker of or a trace of the person. Here's another example to show that indexical typographic markers can foreground the tool more than the person. This is an example from Mads Brenø's novel. It's a Danish novel called David Feldts Efterladte Papir, the posthumous papers of David Feld. And it's about the main character, David Feld, who has, in his own mind, mistakenly been sentenced for murder. The first page of the novel, which is what you see here, consists of a letter from the prison to Feldt's sister, informing her of her brother's suicide in prison and of the fact that he is leaving behind his diary. And that is what the rest of the narrative of the novel consists of. Now, the typeface and layout of the letters make it stand out from the rest of the text. You can't really see that. I should have shown you a couple of pages here. But the thing is that the use of the archetypical typewriter, typeface, courier can be seen as an indexical sign that the letter has been produced by a typewriter with whatever meaning that creates. I'd like to return to Brenø's novel in a moment, so we'll get back to this. But I'll first move on and introduce the iconic semiotic, the principle of iconic typographic meaning, which refers to instances where the typographic signifier looks like or shares qualities with that which it signifies. This is quite a conventional example of that, of iconic typographic signification in the novel. and in other texts as well, I'm sure you know it from text messaging and so on, that we have the visual salience of large capitals that is employed to convey the sonic salience of somebody shouting. But if we get back to Brenø's novel, this is a more experimental example of iconic meaning. Now, and I'm really sorry, it's really hard to reproduce here, but the narrative or the text vacillates between black type and blue type. So that's what I've indicated, just to help you see that. Because after the letter from the prison that you saw before, the rest of the novel consists of Feldt's diary. And that text is set in what I'll call plain black typography. But when Feldt starts writing with an old fountain pen that he has bought in a secondhand bookshop, what he writes actually occurs on the page in blue. So that's what you could have seen here if I could have reproduced it properly. I don't think we experience this blue part of the text as an indexical trace of Feldt and the pen, because this is not what handwriting looks like. But I think we see the iconic resemblance between the distinctive feature of the color blue and blue ink. And the two colors, black and blue, interact in significant ways with wording. So it's not just some kind of gimmick here, but it's actually significant meaning making that is created typographically. Because to begin with, the wording of the blue part of the narrative is apparently unrelated to that of the black part. And now I have rewritten the text here so that you can see an example of it. And I'll just read through it. So he starts out in black, and it says, "How nice it is that the sun is shining so brightly. It's good to see the shadows made on the walls when the sunbeams find small irregularities, bricks that don't fit perfectly, old nails. The pen was incredibly nice to write with. As expected, the little curve on the holder made it fit into my hand almost by itself, as had I been made to hold exactly this pen and no other. But when I read the text on the paper, the handwriting was mine, no doubt about it, but the words I had never seen before. Water she can stand, but that's all, only water. When I realized that, I took my precautions, made sure that she would not harm herself by accident." So according to Feldt here, this is the first time we see writing in blue. And according to Feldt, the text he writes using the blue, or the fountain pen printed in blue, is somebody else's narrative. So he's quite surprised, obviously. Now, this lack of cohesion is quite unsettling in itself. But the horror of the narrative grows when the blue narrative that comes out of the pen gradually turns into the story about a man who keeps the woman he loves prisoner in her flat and starves her to death. And as Feldt becomes more and more absorbed by the narrative he produces with the fountain pen, the gap between the black part of the narrative and the blue part decreases, in the sense that the narrative no longer vacillates between what Feldt believes he's writing in black and what is actually there on the paper in blue. Instead, the narrative increasingly consists of the narrative about the man who's starving the woman he loves to death in blue, and Feldt's reactions to that narrative in black. So they get very closely related, and sometimes the reader almost misses the jump from one to another because they are so closely related. So in this way, the typographic feature of color and its interaction with wording constructs the two different narratives and their increasing interrelatedness. So in this way, the iconic use of colored typography helps to create a significant aspect of the meaning of the novel, that is, the possible schizophrenic nature of Feld's psyche, that and the fact that he is probably the man who kills a woman that he's starving to death, right? And that meaning also comes about through the different color of the typography. Okay, finally, typographic discursive import is seen in cases where a typographic signifier and its connotations are imported from one context into another where they did not previously belong. We see a relatively simple example of that here in Kostover's novel, The Historian, where the chapter headings, as you can see, I don't expect you to read the text, but the chapter headings are set in black letter type. Now, black letter, as you all know, is an old style typeface, and it's not what we expect to encounter in a contemporary novel from 2005. So the connotations of the typeface that are imported visually are meanings such as old and Gothic, and these are typographic meanings which combine well with the Gothic contents of the novel, which turns out to be a modern vampire novel, right? I'd like to show you a less conventional example as well. This is from Graham Rawley's novel Woman's World from 2005. This novel is typographically and narratively unique in that it is being created out of words and phrases that the author cut out of lots and lots of women's magazines from the 1950s and early 1960s. And then he glued them together, all the words, and made up his narrative. So all the pages of the novel look like this. And it's a long novel. It's more than 300 pages. So it was quite a lot of hard work. Now, the novel tells the story of Norma, who lives in and by the world of 1950s and early 1960s women's magazines. She's absorbed by their advice on clothes, on beauty, advertisements, romantic short stories, and features about film stars and other celebrities. And the entire novel is constructed by means of the discursive import of typography and of wording from women's magazines. This may seem like a gimmick, but the fact is that an important aspect of the meaning of the novel is created exactly by this discursive import of the typography and also of specific words, examples of wording. So, like the novel pieces together its narrative from women's magazines, the way you see it here, Norma struggles to piece together her identity and her voice as a woman from the magazines that she is reading. And because of the distinctive features, especially of weight and size and color of these typefaces used, the visual side of the narrative sort of jars on the eye, and that combines with a similar jarring in terms of wording, and those choices of typography and wording make the reader sense that something isn't quite right. And the significance of that becomes clear when we realize that Norma is in fact the female persona of the male protagonist Roy, who secretly cross-dresses as his sister who died in childhood. So it's a way of remembering her and dealing with her death. Now, to get it right, Roy uses women's magazines as a kind of manual, but to judge from the visual side of the narrative as well as from its wording, he never gets it quite right. So the discursive import of the typography actually plays quite an important role in the construction of that meaning. Okay, now, in lots and lots of the examples from literary texts, examples of special typography, it seems that the point of using special typography is to somehow authenticate the contents of the narrative. It can be as indexical traces of a character. It can be iconic similarities. It can be discursive import, like we have seen here. Now, one of the things I encountered quite often in my literary data was different examples of typographic choices made to create the meaning of handwritten. And that makes sense, since that would be a trace of a particular character. And I'd like to show you different ways of creating the meaning of handwritten in different translations of Stieg Larsson's, the Swedish author, Stieg Larsson's Millennium trilogy. It's crime fiction. You may be familiar with Lisbeth Salander and what's his name? Kalle something. Yeah. Now, just have a look. In the original Swedish edition of Stieg Larsson's novel, and this is the novel called The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest in English. Now, in the original Swedish edition, we see a brief note in handwriting from one character to another. This is real handwriting. It's characterized primarily by its irregularity, and it is an example of indexical typographic meaning, a sign of Kalle Blomqvist, that's his name, yes, who wrote the message. It's fictional because Kalle Blomqvist doesn't exist in reality. Now, interestingly, this is what the handwriting looks like in the Danish edition. So here we have the choice, or instead of a typeface that has been constructed to look like handwriting. And this is what it looks like in the English edition, where they have simply used italics. And in the last two examples here, I think the writing is too regular. I mean, it's quite obvious that the writing is too regular to have been produced by hand. So therefore, we are not likely to see them as true indexical marks of the person who wrote the notes. Instead, we have iconic similarity between some of the features of the typography and handwriting. I have constructed a fourth way of realizing the meaning of written by hand. That is, if it simply says in the text that something is handwriting, that of course is also a way of realizing handwriting. And that would be an example of symbolic typographic meaning. I didn't actually find that with this specific example, so I made it myself, but in one of the other three novels, I found an example like this one. So I thought it made sense just to include it here to give you an overview. Now, in the Danish and the English editions, the publishers appear to have opted for the easy and cheap solution of choosing existing typefaces to realize this meaning of handwritten, but with a certain loss of meaning compared to the original Swedish edition of the novel. And these typographic choices in the Danish and English editions reflect, I think, a common failure to appreciate the semiotic potential of typography that is not uncommon in publishing. Whenever a publisher wants to, make a cheap translation or a cheap paperback, we often see that some of these choices are actually not translated, but simply made in an easier and cheaper way. Okay, so I have now presented an approach to typographic analysis that focuses on the communicative potential of typography, and it is an approach that focuses on what typography means and how that meaning is created. The main tools for analysis were those of the distinctive features of typographic use and the semiotic principles involved in typographic meaning making. By way of wrapping up, I would like to point to some challenges of the approach, as well as to what I see as its strengths and contributions to existing research. So let me start with some of the challenges. Now, to judge from the work I've been doing on typography in a literary context, the primary strength of the distinctive features approach lies in capturing and describing features of typefaces that differ notably from each other. So that is typically what we see in the more experimental typographic examples. In contrast to that, the differences between more standard, plain, black typographies are often so small that they cannot really be captured by the approach. For me, in this context of reading literature or analyzing literature from a stylistic perspective, that is not really a problem. But I suppose it could be a problem for someone who would like to apply the approach in another context. It should also be mentioned that the overview of distinctive features I showed you a few slides ago isn't exhaustive. I recently came across some typefaces whose surfaces and edges are semiotic, and those features have not yet been included in the system. So there are missing distinctive feature. This is in a way work in progress where we can keep adjusting the network. Another thing to consider is the question of how detailed an approach like this should be. If we take color as an example, I simply included a choice between black and not black, that is different colors from black. But there are actually a lot of different qualities of color that could be considered as well, color modulation, color saturation, and so on, which would make the system far more complex. I'm in favor of a system that is operational rather than one that contains all the possible choices at several levels of delicacy. But that is, of course, something that depends on what you want or need to do with the system. So other analysts may have different needs. As for the typographic semiotic principles, it should be mentioned that the principles may overlap in the sense that several principles may apply to a given example. So just to give you an example of that, strictly speaking, all typographic signs display some aspect of their own coming into being. I mean, when we look at a typeface, we can tell whether it has been written by hand with a pencil or a pen, or painted with a brush, or printed by technological means. So texts arguably always involve an aspect of indexical meaning in that sense. And with the examples from literature, I suppose that whenever a special typography is used in the novel, that will be an example of discursive import of that typeface into a context where it did not previously belong, along with its connotations. So the categories, these four semiotic typographic principles, are less separate and exclusive than could maybe be wished for. So the analyst will have to consider, well, what is it that makes me focus on this being an example of indexical meaning rather than focusing on its iconic meaning? Okay, let me finish by mentioning some of what I see as the strengths of the approach. So I believe that in spite of the challenges I just mentioned, the approach has lots of potential, which is why I'm standing here talking about it. Now, my primary aim with my work was to extend what we often refer to as the stylistic toolbox with tools for typographic analysis. So in that sense, or by doing so, I have been trying to strengthen the stylistic approach to text analysis so that we also have tools for talking about typography and not just linguistic tools for talking about wording. I think it is an important strength of the approach that it is systematic and detailed, consistent, so that it enables systematic, detailed and consistent analysis of typographic semiosis, not just in literary text, but also in other types of texts, of course. In the process of applying multimodal semiotic tools to new data, that is to literature, I believe to have helped pushing multimodal theory forward in regards to typographic analysis by adjusting and extending and discussing the existing approach. And finally, and maybe this is a little bit optimistic, but I hope that work like what I have just presented could potentially help to increase awareness about the multimodal meaning making, including typographic meaning making, for instance, in a literary context, but also in other contexts, so that maybe publishers could start thinking about what the choices they make, the typographic choices they make when they make a translation of a novel or make a new paperback edition of a novel. Okay, so I think that's it. Yes, my time is up. So thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a question by Terry Joyce. No, okay, I will state the question. It's about handwriting examples. To what extent do you find examples to be legible? That is, to what extent are they constrained to sufficiently readable by others rather than more private code?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Sorry for my accent.
Can I?
So Terry would be better at this. So to what extent do you find examples, so handwriting examples, to be legible? So what's the balance between being legible or rather being a private code?
Or
a private code.
A private code. I don't know. I haven't thought about that. I mean, I think obviously in a literary context, like the example I showed you with the handwritten notes and the margins, for instance, of course, it's really important that those notes are legible, because otherwise the readers can't make sense of it. On the other hand, had some of the notes not been legible, then that would be part of the meaning of the text. Readers might think, oh, no, I can't read this, or why is it that the handwriting is suddenly so hurried or whatever. So it will be meaning making, even though we can't read it. I think, but I'm not sure. I don't know if that
yes, and tomorrow we will have a presentation on asemic writing.
It's simply really difficult for me to hear you. So
I said tomorrow we will have a presentation on asemic writing.
All right,
yes.
Right.
And Richard Sprout would like to ask a question. Richard, can you do it?
Sure. I mean, so there's obvious uses of typography all over the place in advertising, I would say much more commonly than what you get in novels, I'm guessing. Could you compare the two situations?
Yes, I think, my interest, I came from stylistics, and in stylistics, we focus primarily on literary text, not only, but obviously the approach can be used for analyzing typography in advertising, where many of these examples are perhaps even more obvious, in terms of what they mean than is the case in literary texts. What I found, I chose to look at novels for adults because that's a place where we don't usually have use of special typography, for instance, but also images and special layout and so on. So I thought that was quite an interesting context and perhaps not quite as obvious as advertising, but the approach can, of course, be applied to advertising as well.
Okay, question by Jürgen Spitzmüller.
Yes, hello. Hope you can hear me, and thank you for this well-structured talk. I have a question which is somewhat general, maybe also too complex, but a question which addresses your use of the Peirce terminology. Since Peirce himself does not understand these dimensions of semiosis, index, icon, and symbol as being inherent to the signifier or the material, but as a process that emerges in semiosis, which means that one and the same sign can be interpreted indexically, iconically, and symbolically by different people, or even indexically and symbolically and iconically by one and the same person. So the fact that it becomes iconically happens not in the text, but in the reader's perception, in Peirce's understanding. So I wanted to ask you whether this is a deliberate choice to move that out and make it a somewhat more essential category of science.
Well, I completely agree with you that, and the thing is, maybe I should have started out by saying also that my object of analysis is the semiotic object of the novel. So I'm not into, cognitive stuff in terms of how readers make sense of things, and I'm not awfully interested in what the author or the designers of the book intended. What I'm interested in is the meaning that is actually there in the text. And then a problem for this approach to analysis, if we want it to be precise and so on, of course, it's a problem that we may say, well, we have these categories, index and icon, for instance, and discursive import. And sometimes we have examples, or we see all three principles in one example. So what is it that makes us determine whether we call it indexical or choose to call it or focus on the iconic part of it? So I think in a way it's a weakness of the approach. On the other hand, maybe it's opening our eyes to the fact that, several meanings are at play at the same time, and in context, we may be invited to focus more on one thing than on the other. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. Thank you.
The audience?
So this is very much a contextual or contextually oriented approach to communication.
I have just a short question about your theoretical background. If I well understand, you have somehow merged a traditional approach by structural semiotics with the Peircean way to consider the principal type of science. Is it true? In your approach, but because when you speak about typography distinct features, this is structural, definitely.
Uh-huh.
but where you talk about the Peircean categories of sciences, symbol, icon, index, and also discursive import, which reintroduces somehow the category of connotation, which is structural also. You seem to merge the two traditions. Is it true?
Yeah, and I'm quite okay with that. I know that some people are not, and fair enough.
According to me, is a good move.
Right, because I think it makes sense to always consider, where I come from functional linguistics, primarily, and social semiotics and multimodality.
Tradition in linguistics starts from Yamsulu, so, I understand.
What I wanted to say is that my primary focus and our primary focus is on meaning.
Yeah.
And meaning making in context.
Okay.
Right, and function, rather than form. But forms create meaning. So it makes so much sense for me to combine the two.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm really sorry. It's so difficult to be talking to people with two microphones in the same room. It's hard to hear.
Other question from the audience? I have a short question. If we take Jack Kerouac's On the Road, the original was typewritten on a scroll.
Sorry, which?
Jack Kerouac's On the Road.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so if we reproduce a facsimile, then it's rather the indexical way. And if we just use a typewriter font, then it's rather, would it be iconic or discursive import?
So if you use another typewriter font, would it then be?
So, for example, if we translate it into French and use a typewriter font.
Yes. It would probably be, I mean, if it's today, not many novels are set in a typewriter typeface today. So that I would count as, it's discursive import into this context of the novel. But at the same time, we would probably see it as, I don't know. Yes, maybe it does have an element of both indexical and iconic. So a combination of the three.
And symbolic because of the meaning carried, the connotation of typewriter.
In relation to the narrative meaning, yes. So it's far more complex than I've tried to illustrate here. I don't know how far we can go in that direction. What I aimed to do was to find tools that, in my field, people would say at conferences, oops, this novel I'm analyzing that is from a stylistic perspective is using special typography and images and stuff. I think we have to forget about that because we haven't got tools for analyzing that. So my point was that's my starting point. We need tools for analyzing those bits of the communication that takes place between the author and the reader through the narrative of the novel. And that's what I tried to do. But I'm sure that we could dive into more detail here and there and maybe find more complexities and problems, challenges. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.